Rock and roll. Okay, dokie. So today we're talking about shape design. So first of all, like just defining kind of what we mean by shape design. When we are making art, we're making decisions on how we're showing things on the canvas. Like, even if we're doing a still life or something, we're looking at the light and shadow patterns that we're seeing, and we're interpreting that then onto the canvas. And there is a good degree of design that goes into that because every artist is going to interpret those very complex, like photographic shapes slightly differently. Um, Even in like photorealistic art, you will still have some shape design, although generally with photorealistic art, the goal is to make things as photo-like as possible, versus if you look at something that's maybe more impressionistic or something stylized, then there's a lot of designing of those shapes that goes into it. And in general, shape design is one of the main things that makes art more appealing or makes art look more interesting than a photo of the exact same topic. So if you take like a reference photo and then the art that was made from that photo and you put them side by side, most of the time, if it's done well, the art is going to feel more interesting and more appealing. And a lot of the time, that's down to the shape design and more specifically, the simplification of those shapes. So then the natural question to ask is like, okay, if it comes down to shape design and simplification, like how do I know what to keep and what to throw out? And that's basically like the design philosophy that we're going to talk about today. So what makes good shapes? Um, the first thing is the types of lines that you're using, like the straights versus the curves. And even before this, I arguably you could say simplicity also makes appealing shapes. So before we even get to straights versus curves, if we have a shape in our photo that we see and it's got these like little jogs and it's going like this, maybe it's like a part of a plant or something, right? Like this is not a very appealing shape. It's a busy shape and there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? If I take this shape and I get rid of some of this detail that's not necessarily serving the shape so much. So let's say we keep some of this character, but we edit and we make some parts bigger and some parts simpler and cleaner. You'll see what I mean here in a sec, but we'll end up with a just cleaner, more interesting and appealing feeling shape, which in turn, if you make an entire image out of shapes like this, is going to give you an appealing and interesting image. So for instance, like this, right? We can see that like as we look at these two shapes, I've tried to keep the proportions and the character the same, but you can see the one on the right just feels more interesting. It feels cleaner because it's already kind of been like pre-processed. Our brain doesn't have to try to smooth out all of these little wibbles and jogs. It's already been done for us. Um, so that's some of it is simplicity. But then on top of that, there's this idea of like straights versus curves. And what this means is when we're looking at shapes, there's usually going to be a blend. There's going to be a blend of straights and curves within any given shape. And even if we're doing something like an art study where we're not even working from a photo, we're going to see blends of straights and curves. Now, as a stylistic choice, you can choose to lock everything into straights, and that's a valid choice. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about appealing shapes, it'll have a little bit of a blend of straights and curves. So, for example, these two lines I might simplify to a curve, and then we have a straight here. Maybe there's a straight here, but then we curve around the top like this. We come in and around like this, right? So this one on the left is again going to feel like a slightly more interesting version of the shape on the right. And the reason for that is that we're breaking the pattern. So instead of it just being straights and like or just straights or just curves, we've got this interesting blend happening between the two of them where we have some nice solid straight lines that hold everything down. But then we've also got some curved lines that are tying everything back together and making them getting some variation. And you'll see when I did it over here, as this example, I simplified it, but I also simplified it into specifically like straights and curves very intentionally. And that's gonna just be a habit that pretty much applies across the board for art. The more you can mix those kind of straights and curves, the more interesting it'll be. I'm sure you've heard of like CSI when it comes to gesture. This is a big thing that comes up in gesture, but a lot of artists don't realize that that applies to everything. So, what CSI is, just as a kind of quick refresher, is when you're doing your gesture drawings, let's say you're doing a person, That's doing like a lunge or something. And their arms are out in a T pose, right? It's going to be more interesting if you can get a blend of C curves, S curves, and straights, as opposed to just any one specific thing of those. So, for example, if we take this front leg and maybe we have like this, but then we curve like this to show some of the weight. We take this back leg like this. Let's have him hunch over a little bit and arms like this. We end up with a more dynamic feeling pose and a more interesting feeling pose, even though the base pose that we're working with is not actually different. And that's because we have a blend of like the arms are this S curve, we've got a C curve here and in some of the legs, we've got a couple straights tying down like the important parts of the legs, like grounding the figure. And so this is going to, again, give us a more interesting feeling and a more dynamic feeling gesture. And the same exact thing applies when we're looking at our shapes. By blending those C curves, S curves, and I curves, we get that same thing as with gesture. We get more dynamic shapes. We get shapes that feel like they have motion. Okay, moving right along. Another thing is the weight transfer of the shape. And the way that I think about this, really, this is most commonly seen in sculpting, where you'll have a form. Let's say you have a form that's turning a corner like this, and sculptors will think about the transfer of weight that that form has. So, for example, they'll have it be steeper here, and then they'll have it shallow out like this, and then maybe there's more weight on one side. This makes very appealing feeling curves and appealing feeling forms. And we can use that exact same principle when we're designing our shapes as well. So because we're working in 2D, even if it's like the impression of 3D, but we're still fundamentally working 2D, right? So what we can think of it as is visual weight transfer within the shape. So to take another shape here, let's say we've got a fairly squarish shape like this, and I'm going to design a bad shape here. This is fairly even. Like we can see there's a little bit, it's a little bit top heavy, but it's not super duper top heavy. If we take this, we're going to apply our straights versus curves. So first of all, I'm going to look for some of these lines. Let's say we want to make this one a little bit curved like this. Maybe we curve these in, or maybe we actually, let's keep the top straight and then let's curve the sides. That might feel better. But I'm going to try to transfer that weight more intentionally. So I'm intentionally top weighting it. And I guess you could argue that this loses a little bit of the character of the original shape, but it also makes a more interesting version of the original shape. Other things we could do would be, for instance, if we take this center part and we bulge it out just a little extra to give even more weight up top, we're ending up with more interesting design to those. The other thing we can think about is even if we don't want to change, let's forget for a minute about like the straights and the curves and stuff, and let's just change the shape, but let's keep the character of the straight lines. We can basically push one part of that shape, and I'm going to do it off to the side actually. Grab a duplicate here. We can push one part of that shape bigger or smaller to try to show more weight transfer on one side or the other. So for example, I could take this and I could make it just a little bit smaller and narrower, like this. And then I could take the top side and I could just push it out a little bit more. So I haven't really changed any of the lines. I haven't really significantly changed the shape. But again, if I put these side by side, you're going to feel like that left side is just a bit more interesting. It's got a little bit more, it just feels like more solid. It feels more intentional. It feels more designed. And that's just because we've basically intentionally designed some weight transfer within that shape. A big point that weight transfer will come up is when we have things like curves. So for example, if we have a shape like this, and we very intentionally kind of weight the shape towards the top and then have it tapering down towards the bottom. This is a kind of a formula that you'll see a lot that gives very interesting and dynamic shapes. Even if we have things that are like pinched in the middle like this, or if we have shapes where, I don't know, they're like curving around, um, we get this like kind of croissant-y look to them where there's more weight at one end than the other. This is actually not that clean. So maybe we do something like this, right? We end up with this feeling of weight down towards the bottom of this shape. And actually, I'm going to accent it even more. pull this line in like this. So now you see how that even that change made this shape feel more interesting just from an abstract point of view. Now, obviously, these shapes do have to describe stuff unless we're working with abstract art. But the trick with art and with stylization is basically to balance like how far can I push the shapes that I'm seeing while still having it be readable what it is that we're looking at. And that's oftentimes where the design part comes in is we're trying to figure out how far we can push any given thing. So that's weight transfer. That's another thing to consider. Another one is symmetry and asymmetry or organicness. So shapes that are very symmetrical will be very boring for the most part. So here's a very symmetrical shape. If I take that same shape and let's maybe shorten one of the sides, let's get some of that symmetry coming in here. It still feels kind of like the same shape, but it's just a more interesting stylized version of it, or a more interesting and dynamic version of it. Another good example is if we get a shape like this kind of fish type shape. This is very symmetrical. If we wanted to push this further, so for example, let me think about how to do this. Maybe we push it like this. Let's keep that back portion, but I'm going to weight it ever so slightly towards the top, and I'm going to pinch it a little bit more down here. Maybe we weight it even more towards the top. So these are minor adjustments that I'm making, but this bottom shape is still going to feel just a little bit more interesting than that top one. And the reason is just that it's not perfectly symmetrical. You can also think of this as like organic versus inorganic. And there's a link that I'll show you guys at the end of this, where if you're interested in this kind of thing, one of the absolute like gods of shape design is Cynics. I'm sure you've heard of him on YouTube. And if you haven't, you should, because he's very, very good at this. Um, so yeah, but this is he calls it organic versus inorganic. I think of it more as like symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Um, you can think of it either way. Another thing is large, medium, and small. And this is a more of a just general design principle, but it applies recursively across your canvas. So the basic principle is this. Let's say we have a canvas and we've got three shapes that are basically all the same spacing and distance from each other and size. That's going to be much less interesting than if we've got a large shape, a small shape, and a medium shape. This is just a kind of a fundamental design principle that you'll see recurring a lot, is this idea of large, medium, small. And you'll find this as well in like a lot of art forms. People will just hammer. People seem to really love like this large, medium, small, large, medium, small. But you can apply the same thing when you're designing your shapes. So for example, I can have a large line here, medium line here, small line here. So medium kind of curve. Maybe we'll make it an S curve just to keep things interesting. And I guess another medium here. That's going to be a more interesting shape than if we had made all of these lines roughly the same kind of size, kind of like that. You see how this one just feels a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more interesting? It's because there's more of a difference between those. And of course, we're starting to apply more and more of this. So we can see we've got weight kind of over here, whereas there's less weight over here. We can see we've got our straights and curves, and we've got S curves and all that good stuff. This is an asymmetrical shape, and now we're starting to also apply large, medium, small. If it helps, you also don't have to think of it in terms of the line. You can also think of it as just the shape itself. So for example, if we have a shape like this, we've got, and it's gonna tidy this up a bit. Maybe we make this a curve. So we've got kind of this large area up here. We've got some kind of medium to the silhouette somewhere in here. And then maybe we'll add a little flange off this side. This is our small. And so we're ending up with, again, this kind of interesting shape. And you'll see I'm kind of combining all of these elements together as we're going down the list. So you can think of this in either way. Large, medium, small, you can pretty much apply it across the board. You can also apply it in like color distribution, where you have a lot of one color, a sum of another color, and then just a little hint of a third color. You can apply it in values, where you have a predominantly dark image and then there's a moderate amount of like mid value and then just a tiny bit of highlight, or vice versa. You can apply it in compositional splits. So if you think about like the golden ratio, which I'm just going to eyeball, it splits something like this. I'm sure you notice a pattern here: large, medium, small. So this applies recursively. You can also apply this when you're doing like character design, for example. If you have a character, I'm just gonna do a little stick guy. Um, you can have elements of their design where it's like, okay, we have a relatively large size shirt and then like a small sash and medium sized pants. That's going to give you like an interesting, well balanced feeling character. So that's a little bit of a digression, but the point being that this is like a fractal, right? You can take this and apply it to your character design, but then within like the sash, the shapes that make up that sash can also use large, medium, small, and the colors and the patterns can also use the same. And then gesture and exaggeration. And this is where you get kind of a sense of almost like flow to a shape. So an example is if I take a shape like this, I'm going to try to get straights versus curves. I'm basically going to try to get everything except for that gesture and exaggeration into it. So give me a second to think about what that would look like. Maybe something like this. So this shape has a very balanced gesture to it. It's basically just a straight line. And we're still making it with C curves, S curves, and I curves. We've still got a little bit of all that. There's still a large, medium, and small going on. I could probably make this a little bit smaller if I wanted to try to keep that. So we've got a large shape here. Yeah, that's better. Large, medium, small. We've got all of that stuff, but there's still something that just feels like it's kind of missing, something that could be pushed with this shape. And that's where it comes into the gesture or the exaggeration of the shape. So they're kind of related and they're kind of different. Gesture is like the direction that it feels like the shape is flowing in. It works exactly the same as gesture, like human gesture or gesture studies. Um, and then exaggeration is like the difference between the parts. So here I have a large, a medium, and a small, but they're kind of roughly evenly spaced between each other. And there's not like the large isn't massive and the small isn't tiny, right? So what we can do is we can take this same shape. I'm going to give it a little bit of flow because I feel a little bit of weight coming down this way. So I want to accent that. I'm going to say, okay, I want to give it a little bit of a curve as far as a gesture. And then I'm also going to accent the large, medium, and small parts of it. So I'm going to make my large part of the shape very large, and I'm accenting this a lot so you guys can see. So I'm going to make this large, like huge, something like that. And then I'm going to get my S curve in here like this. So I have my medium kind of coming in like this. I'm going to take that, and then I'm going to make my small like tiny. And maybe let's get another straight in here just to mix things up. And I think I actually want to make this even bigger. So here, this is extremely exaggerated, but we can feel that now the shape has this kind of circular motion to it, where our weight transfer is going kind of like this, as opposed to straight down. And we've got much more of a difference between like our large, our medium, and our small. And I think I could probably fiddle with it a little bit more. Maybe something like that. You see how that made that even more interesting? Because I realized they were all roughly equal. So tried to change that. So all of this put together is going to give you good shapes. But then the question is like, okay, how much do we do it? Because for example, um, here you could argue that this is just, I mean, it kind of sort of keeps the character of the original shape, but it's very different, right? And so the question then comes up like, great, we have these sort of tools, but how much do we use them or how far do we push our shapes? And that really boils down to how stylized you want things to look. The more you push these, the more you're going to get a stylized look. Um, and the most obvious version of this is if you look at cartoons, they're extremely stylized because they have a huge amount of gesture and exaggeration. They also actually stay away from curves, or sorry, they stay away from straights. This is kind of a side note, but in general, if you want something to look more realistic, use straights, and if you want it to look more stylized, use curves. It's not a universal principle, but it actually is something. Some of it is because straights are easier to measure, so you can get more accurate measurements. But then some of it also is just if you lock everything to a curve, you're going to get that like early cartoon vibe where they had like these noodle arms and stuff. Um, It just lends itself to a very stylized look when you use mostly curves or entirely curves. So just another like random side note. But yeah, basically, if you imagine all of this as a spectrum from the photo, like just perfect copy of the photo, versus like a totally stylized version of it, um, you can kind of choose for each of these elements where to put it on that line. And this is where shape design is interesting because every single artist will put each of these weights somewhere differently on this line. And that's what will ultimately lead to like a unique style or a unique look to something. Um, so taking a little bit of an example for this, just to keep plowing information down, we've got here two very similar images. One is a photograph and one is a piece of art. And we can take a look at how the shapes, at some of the shapes I'm seeing here. So for example, we get this pectoral shape here. I'm gonna grab a color that I think we can actually see, maybe like a bright neon. Let me think about this. So let's grab, I see a shape that goes like this. So this is a pretty well-designed shape. We've got some straights, we've got some curves, we've got a very clear weight to it, and it's fairly simple. If I try to find a similar shape, let's say over here, it's kind of on the other pec, but kind of similar, we get a much more complex shape. And this is always going to happen when you look at like photographs. It's also why it's easier to make studies of art because that simplification's already been done. But for instance, here, I see a much more busy shape on this right-hand side. I'm going to turn that down a little bit so we can actually see it, just like that. So hopefully this makes sense. Here we've got more simple. Here we've got more busy. If I try to take even like this same kind of muscle grouping, it's kind of like this shape here. Obviously, these aren't the exact same image, but hopefully it still shows. So again, we're losing a lot of the little bumps and nicks, and only the ones that are absolutely necessary to show what's there are kept. They're also exaggerated. So again, we've got a nice large, we've got a medium, we've got a small. We've got a little bit of a blend of straights and curves. It's all very interesting. Here, everything is kind of the same size. There's not a huge amount of design to it. And so just as a kind of capstone, let's go ahead and redesign this shape here as if we're painting it. So I'm going to grab my light color and let's go ahead and pull this down a little bit like this and here, and I'm going to cut this in more. So we get something more like this. Here, I want to make this nice and flat. So I'm trying to blend in some of my stuff. I don't feel like that little bump is super important, so I'm going to get rid of it. Here, I want to have a separation between these shapes, so I'm going to separate them. Here, I'm going to pull this up and across and out a little bit more, and then back in like this. So we could say like, okay, here's our light shape. You'll see we're still defining the same part of the muscle. Obviously, I've messed with the values a little bit, but we're still defining the same part of the muscle. But we end up with a much cleaner, more interesting, more painterly kind of a shape. And if we were to go throughout the image and just do this throughout, and obviously, like we've lost our edges here. I know we had a previous week where we talked about edges and why they're important. Um, but for now, at least, we're just kind of focusing on the shapes. But if you go throughout your image and do this, you're going to end up with a painterly feeling image, an interesting feeling image. And so that's basically the like a super truncated 5-minute view of shape design. Those are kind of the main elements. That's like the 80/20 of it. And there's a lot of different ways to apply this. But once you know kind of what you're looking for, you can look at your favorite artist or at styles that you like, and you can figure out what it is that they're doing. Um, like what it is that they're doing and how they're applying these. So for example, here we can see that there's a lot of fairly straight edges on this. um, there are still curves, but even their curves, they're breaking into straights. And there's a lot of like hard planes, very simple shapes. And this gives you like a Valorant kind of a look when you do this. Some of this is also the blue light, but as far as the shapes are concerned. And so if you looked at, for instance, like a fine art painting, you're going to find a totally different character to shapes, but they're still stylized shapes. And that's really the main takeaway is um, that idea of the way that you apply these principles is what's going to drive what the end result style looks like. But once you're aware of them, then you can start to control them. And once you can start to control them, then you can start to get more interesting shapes and get the styles that you're looking for. Um, so yeah, that's kind of like your very quick and dirty on shape design. I know that's a huge amount of information. Um, Real quick, I do want to throw out, if you liked or if you found this interesting, a person that explains it extremely well, much better than me, is this guy Cynics on YouTube. He does some very, very good videos that he calls his design theory series, and he has one on shape appeal. It'll cover some of the stuff we went into today, but it'll also like go more in depth on some of it. So if you thought this was interesting, definitely look him up on YouTube. And with that huge info dump, I think we'll take a second and open it up if there are any questions on anything we covered today. I'm going to pull up the chat so that I can see it, because I only have one monitor, because I am a scrub. If there's no questions, that's cool too. You can feel free to type or you can feel free to talk. And if it was just all crystal clear, that's great too.
Honestly, I really liked it, but at the same time, I feel like I'm too dumb to kind of understand it for fully.
No worries. To be fair, I threw
Can,
a lot of information very quickly. Um, but one of the nice things about this type of fundamental in art is that really what's most important is being aware that it exists. And then your brain will kind of fill in the gaps and catch up as you look at art and artists that you like. You'll start to notice those elements, and then that'll make it easier to apply them. But no, that's fair. That makes sense.
Yeah,
is it okay?
because go ahead, go ahead. Sorry.
Is it okay if I put like an art in the chat and you can show me how they use shape design? Because what the style I'm going for is more of like a photorealistic, but I know that like I still want to like figure out how I can stylize things. But yeah, I'll put
Yeah,
it in the
hit me.
chat.
Perfect. Let me grab it.
Oh, that's a great one.
Okay. So yeah, let's take a look.
I feel like because there's not really like really big lighting shapes, so I feel like a lot of it's like the clothing. That's the where the shapes being used,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure.
So one thing we can do is I can switch this to grayscale because the color sometimes makes things harder to see. So I'm going to switch it to grayscale so that we can see more clearly what we're working with. And yeah, so let me just outline some of the shapes I'm seeing, and I think you'll see some of the same principles we were just talking about. So here's a good shape that comes up. This whole entire like cauldron area is its own shape, right? And we get some of that same stuff where we've got a straight here, we've got some curves, and we've got some definite weight to the shape. But then also within that, we get little shapes like this, which actually have the same thing going on. So here, these are a little bit more square, but even then they're not perfectly square. They taper a little bit down towards this end here, right? We're also getting, there's a lot of shape design going on in the dagger down here. This is very stylized. So we're getting like, for instance, this handle has a nice curve to it. We're getting a transfer of weight in some of these curves. So we get shapes like this. We also can look at silhouette shapes, but then also at shapes of light and shadow. And you'll see this a lot in fine art where, for example, this is a great example. When we look at this value shape, this is all shadow, right? And so really what we have is a shadow shape that looks like this. And then we've got a light shape within it. But I'm seeing a lot of curves in these. This is another good example of like a fairly well-designed shape here. I'm seeing a lot of curves. I'm seeing even here. So you see how they've done these folds? We get these like crescent shapes coming out. So let me grab a darker shade. So we get this like crescent shape like this. And we're seeing that shape kind of repeated throughout. It's just kind of like slightly longer or slightly narrower. Here's another example. This one, I guess, is more of a slightly less crescenty. We get a shape like this. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but basically they're simplifying. I'm not seeing a lot of like wobble. So for example, I'm not seeing like a cut in here where this fold connects, right? They've simplified that
Right.
out into just one nice big shape. And I'm seeing that kind of throughout. I'm not seeing a lot of, there's some little texture here, but for the most part, they're keeping their light shapes very clean. Here's another example, just trying to get a color that'll actually show up. This kind of zigzag shape coming in here. And it looks like they've done a lot of this for the cloth. This is a really nice shape to use for stylized cloth. But there's very little like deviation to this shape. So here we can see there's a little bit of value here where there's like a wrinkle coming across, but they didn't make that its own. They didn't cut it in like this because that would make this other shape less interesting. It would make it more noisy. You see that?
Yeah.
Um,
No, yeah, that answers a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. This is a very detailed image. There's a lot going on here, which is very cool. I'm just taking a look. If I squint up at the face here, I mean, obviously we've got things like the shape of the eye, where it's this kind of clean, like two crescents, like this. Shapes like the fur, like this, they've kept the edges very clean. So sometimes, and if you looked at like a real animal, there would be probably more of this kind of jagged edge to it because it's fur, right? But they've kept those shapes actually very clean. Even when we look down here, these kind of shapes for the patterning are kept very clean. And they're only kind of pulling a couple strands off of them to indicate the fur texture. But these are very simplified. But it works, right? When we take the thing out and we zoom out, it's like, yeah, that's fur. Because we've got fur on the silhouette here, we've got it catching light here, and some of these shapes have a little bit of smudge to them, but they're still keeping it pretty clean. So hopefully that helps. um,
No, yeah.
oh, um, awesome. Let's see what else we got here. The rendering is super clean, but the thumbs are on the wrong sides. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
that's
god,
my
yeah, no.
that character specifically has like wrong side thumbs. That's like
It
it's just my style, or their style, you know?
A
yeah,
fair thing.
it
Yeah.
annoys me
Thank you.
so much though. It feels so wrong.
Yeah. Oh. Um, let's see. I think there were some other questions. I'm not sure. Since I've got streamer mode on, I can only see B, but I think it's Blue Tiger, if I remember right. Did you have
Oh
another
yeah,
question?
I did not have any other questions.
Okay, cool. In that case, I'll kill the recording real quick, and then I'll just open